I'm here with artist, writer, film critic, William O. Tyler. How are you doing today?
You today.
Definitely. Thank you so much for taking the time. You grew up in Washington, D.C.
Yep, I sure did.
What was it like growing up there?
It's funny, I was thinking about this recently. It was amazing. Like it's Chocolate City. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s in DC. I'm an 80s baby, but really the formative years of the 90s. And it was just blackness everywhere and I loved it. I live in California now and I kind of miss it. It's not the same. But yeah, it was I loved growing up in DC. I went to Duke Ellington School of the Arts, so I was always surrounded by blackness and art and everything. It was amazing.
Yeah, Duke Ellington School of Arts is a very, prestigious school. They have notable alumni such as Dave Chappelle, Clifton Powell. What was it like, going to a school like Duke Ellington School of the Arts?
Well, it's interesting because you have to audition to get into Duke Ellington, and I auditioned for three different departments actually. So for people who don't know about Duke Ellington, it's a almost like a college prep school, but it's all geared towards the arts. So you do all of the regular things that high school students do, but you then take art classes in addition to that, and each all of your arts are different departments, so you get to focus on a particular thing. So it's like having a major in college. Um, and I actually auditioned for visual arts. I auditioned for dance because I loved to dance as a kid, and I auditioned for literary media, which is all writing and media, television production, radio production, that kind of stuff. Um, and I ended up going for literary media, and that really became up until that point, I really thought I was going to be more of a just a visual artist. My dad's a visual artist. My mom did architecture, so I grew up around like um, my parents just drawing and painting everything. So I thought that's what it was going to be for me, and just that. But then when I went down this track of literary media, and I incorporated art into that, and television and film production and that kind of stuff, that really was formative in me becoming like who I am today, as far as writing and drawing, and also doing like film criticism and understanding all of that kind of stuff.
Definitely. After you leave the Duke Ellington School of Arts, you go to the Savannah College of Art Design and you're a film major.
Yep, yep. I was only there for a year. That was before SCAD became what it is now. SCAD is like a huge place for creatives to go to now. And it was growing then. It was like sort of a newer school. I can't remember how long it had been around, but it was still getting its footing. And I remember going there for a year and loving the school, loving the atmosphere of being in Savannah, Georgia, because I also went to the Carolinas every summer as a kid, so I love being in the South as well. Um, but there was something that was just, I can't even put my finger on it. There was something that didn't feel like home to me, so I ended up going back home a year after going to Savannah. I was only at SCAD for a year, and then I moved back to DC to go to American University to finish school.
Right. American University has a beautiful campus. What was it like, going to American University and like I seen like previous interviews where you talked about like, developing a love for comic books through storyboarding because like, you would like storyboard and realize like, it was a more efficient way to tell your stories. Like, it was a lot less, it was more cost effective, basically.
Exactly. You've been watching other interviews. I think that's awesome. Yeah, that's exactly what happened at American University. Because so Savannah College of Art and Design and American University, I was studying film at both. And while I was studying film at American, one of my mentors was like, you're great at storyboarding. Like you should, really try to get into storyboarding for film. And so I started to focus on doing that. And I've always been a storyteller just in general. Like I've always had all these stories in my head that I wanted to get out. And in film, especially back then, it's a lot easier now because we have um, so much more low budget resources now. People can just pick up their iPhone and make a movie. Back then, this was the 90s, or early 2000s is when I graduated from AU. Um, we didn't have quite the same resources, and so everything was still pretty much took a lot of money to make, a lot of money to raise and make a movie. And so I started to look at comics as a way to storyboard the stories that I wanted to make movies of. But as I was, creating comics in that aspect, I was like, the comics are great as they are. I don't really I would still like to make movies, yeah, but I don't really need a movie particularly to tell the stories that I was telling. Once it was there on a page, it was like this is a comic. This is a finished comic. It can go out like it is, and so that's how I ended up in comics. In addition to doing film stuff.
After you graduate from American University, you immediately moved to California?
Let's see. I graduated American in 2003. My first comic came out in 2004, and then I moved uh, to California at the end of 2004. So it was a year. Yep. A couple
Definitely.
months after I put my first book out, I actually established a company in DC to self-publish. And then as soon as I did that, I picked up and moved and had to reestablish the company in California and transfer all of it. It was a hassle. But yeah, it was a good thing to do.
Your first comic was The Golf Queen Needs a Mate.
Yep.
Can you tell me a little bit about that and like, just like, the process of self-publishing and how it was received?
Um, Surprisingly, it was received pretty well. So the story behind it was I was actually doing fashion shows and stuff in DC. If you know the DC youth black culture, there's lots of fashion shows and entertainment like that. So we were always doing fashion shows and stuff. And I had come up with this idea of a performance that was based around a girl who was having the different models come out holding different body parts and throwing them into a cauldron and then creating this mate for herself. So the idea of the Goth Queen needs a mate actually came from doing this artsy stuff, this fashion stuff. But I like the story so much that I ended up turning it into a comic, and it's really about um, playing God and trying to create something for yourself but not really doing it in the best way, so it becomes like this whole tragic cycle that never ends because there's always death and there's always love trying to bring it back. And um it was a big endeavor for me to try to do this on my own. I actually, I wrote it all, I drew it all, and then put it all together. I, like I said, started a company to publish it, and figuring out like all the legalities and all that stuff like straight out of college was like I didn't know what I was doing. I jumped head first into it, but it turned out well. It ended up being listed as one of the hot titles of the summer in Wizard Edge magazine, which was like Wizard magazine was a big
Right, yeah.
comic magazine back then, but Wizard Edge was their independent, like focused special. And it was listed in there, and that was quite surprising. The drawback was because when you're young and trying something new, you're really exuberant about it, especially when you're jumping headfirst into it. And so I'm like, oh, this is going to sell like hotcakes. I think this is something that a lot of first-time publishers, self-publishers do. They're like, this is going to sell like hotcakes. I'm going to order so many of them. So even though it was well received, I had ordered so many that I still have boxes and boxes of that book. I
Wow.
sold a bunch, but then I still have a lot left over. It's too much. You have to be smart about, what you're actually doing and how it's going to be for the future. You want to make sure you have something that sells out, and then if you need to, you can reprint it as opposed to having too much and just stacking boxes in your house for years.
Most definitely. So you decided, like, after the publication to move to California. What was it like, initially going to California and trying to, you know, continue, like, self-publish?
Yeah, well, kind of like I said earlier, California was a culture shock to me because I grew up around just pure blackness, like black everywhere I could turn. Also being, like I said, growing up in the 90s, we had lots of great black media in the 90s, television and movies that we don't quite have the same these days, unfortunately. So moving to California was it was two things. It was a culture shock because that was the first time outside of Savannah, which was only a year, that I was away from home and away from that kind of culture. Um, and coming to California, like the East Coast and the West Coast are just so different. Like
Right.
everyone on the West Coast is just so laid back, and I appreciate that. But it was just very different from what I was used to. So I had to get my footing as far as that. But then the other thing was the reason that I actually decided to move to California is because I was dating someone who had family who owned a house in California that was empty. And the house was it's actually the house that I'm still in now. I've been living here all this time. So this house is about 10 minutes drive away from Disneyland.
Oh,
And
wow.
a dream of mine growing up was always to work for Disney. So when I heard that there was a house that I could live in rent free that was next to a dream of mine, I was like, hey, let's move to California and see where that takes us. So we moved to California. My partner and I moved out here together. I got a job at Disney and I worked for Disney and I checked that off my dream list. So even while I was like getting my footing in this different culture, it was still like a dream come true. It was still something that I was enjoying wholeheartedly. And a certain or not aspect, but a certain chunk of my life uh devoted to Disney that I really loved for a long time.
Right. That's really cool. Like, especially living, like, so close and being able to pursue your dreams. And I think, like, I've heard that from a lot of people in the past, like, who have worked for Disney. Some people have had mixed experiences, but your experience seems to be positive. As a puppeteer, what was it like working for Disney?
Well, I will say every like I said, it was a chunk of time that was great with Disney. The whole experience was not positive. I also have a very mixed experience, and I think that's something that, like you said, a lot of people who work for Disney go into it with this dream of what Disney is, because Disney, everyone knows Disney, everyone associates it with magic and dreams coming true and like um, artistry and wholesomeness, and that's what Disney sells. And so while I was working there, I started out in attractions, and then I ended up moving to entertainment to become a puppeteer, like you said. And I puppeteered there for 9 years. I worked there for 10 years total. Um, and puppeteering there was amazing. Like I also grew up, in addition to loving Disney, I grew up loving the Muppets and puppets in general. So it really was a kind of a crossing of a lot of things that I loved coming together, and it was a great time in my life. Um, that, like I said, I worked there for 9 years, and of the 9 years puppeteering, probably about seven of them were amazing. I
Okay.
worked with a lot of cool other puppeteers, a lot of cool managers and people. We really became like a close-knit family. The last couple of years working there, some things happened. I don't know if you want me to go into detail.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
fine giving
sure.
the juicy details, but
Yeah,
so so the way that the puppeteers worked at Disneyland, there was one specific show that was very puppeteer heavy that was performed every day, 6 times a day. And in addition to that, there were other spots that puppeteers would do throughout the park, whether it was like meet and greet characters or other little shows or just like pop-up things. But this one show in particular was very demanding. It was a small cast. There were only, out of everyone working at Disney, there were only about 30 people who were puppeteers. So it was a very small unit. And this show was so demanding that people started to be hurt. They would get hurt doing, I mean, it's a very physically demanding job. Most of the time when you see puppets on television, they're doing takes that are like a couple minutes max, and then they put their arm down or something like that. And we were doing shows that were 30 minutes long, so we would have our arms up in the air holding these heavy puppets for 30 minutes at a time, coming down, up and down a little bit, but for the most part we were on for 30 minutes. So people were getting hurt, and Disney being this big company, you would think that they'd be like, okay, we can take care of you, no problem. And they just kind of ignored everything. So we ended up unionizing. And when you unionize at a huge company like Disney, it does not go well. It historically does not go well. Big corporations do not like unions. So the last couple of years, there were kind of the nightmare to end off the dream that was Disney.
For sure. And after you leave Disney, you create a pen name, Link's Delirium, you begin exploring the recurring themes of love and death in your work. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Link's Delirium actually came from that was actually before Disney. That was the name that I did the Goth Queen under, and I did a couple of other books under that name. And like I was saying, the Goth Queen was all about love and death. So I was exploring that stuff through all of my works. Um, the partner that I moved out here with, his name was David Paul Brown. Um, he and I, started to, even as I was working with Disney, I had this, it was a good thing that I had set up this other company to self-publish, because then all of my legal works were under this other company, because working with Disney, they would try to claim all kinds of things. So I had things set up in a way that I was still making comics as I was working for Disney, but I was doing it under this pen name. So uh, my partner David was helping me put comics together. He was really helping support all of that. And just before we started unionizing at Disney, all of this stuff is going on at the same time. David unfortunately passed. So there was a there was a real reckoning within myself of like all of the stories that I have been telling were about love and about death, and then here I am in the middle of like my partner passing, and how I reconcile that with, you know, what I'm going through in real life and what I'm going through in my work, and it just made everything much more passionate, and I think that was a part of why I was so excited to unionize, because I was like this, I was already in the mindset of like fuck the world. And in a mindset of like, if we're going to be existing in this world, it needs to be better for us, because I'm done with it all at the moment. And so that really pushed not only the unionizing on Disney, but also pushed me to start doing work that was I want to say more authentic. Um because I know I'm like all over the place on this timeline,
Oh.
but going back to like the Goth Queen, um, when that book came out, I was really doing stories. It was a story that I wanted to tell, but it was also a story that I wanted to use to try to break into the industry. And so I was doing a story that I thought the industry wanted to see. So I'm a black queer man, and I'm telling the story about a white heterosexual couple. And it wasn't until all of this other stuff was coming later that I started to look at what was important and what was authentic. And I was like, that the Goth Queen Needs a Maid isn't really authentic to me. So that's when I started to focus more on creating stories that were about blackness and about queerness and about things that were actually coming from me, as opposed to telling stories about uh, what I wanted, what I thought people wanted to see. And that's also when I dropped the Link's Delirium pen name and started using my own real name. So
Okay.
it kind of is symbolic in that way.
And you created the character Rat Boy, which is based on your partner, the late David Paul Brown. Can you talk a
Yep.
little bit about that character?
Yep. So that was one of the characters that I created while working at Disney. And David was always just like a really wild and fun character. Like we used to do conventions together, and he would really draw in people. I know I'm talking a lot, but I'm actually kind of socially anxious. Like when I'm at
Good,
events
yeah,
and
that's
conventions and stuff.
what you're here for, yeah.
When I'm at conventions and stuff, I'm kind of like quiet. I'm not the best at like selling my own product. I'm better at selling other people's work than selling my own stuff, which is something I'm working on. But David was always the one that would bring in people and get attention, and he started to um, dress up like a rat at the conventions. And so together we kind of created this idea of Rat Boy, and I started to draw him into comics, and it basically is David's personality, a lot of stuff that David was into, um, just told through this fictional character who's like a prankster. He's kind of like another character that kind of like jumps into everything head first without thinking about it. So he gets in a lot of trouble, and that's kind of how we both were at the time. So um yeah, Rat Boy is a really fun character. I haven't done anything with him in a long time, but I think I might bring him back at some point.
Definitely. Eventually, you start doing cinephilia, which is a deep dive into your love of film and how the art form moves in tandem with society.
Yeah, so I started to do I had this idea of like this whole time that I'm making comics, I'm still really interested in film, and I'm still obsessed with film. And I think it was after David's passing actually that I just jumped into escapism, and I was watching movies upon movies. Like I have a letterbox, and whenever people look at my letterbox, they're always shocked at how many movies I've actually seen. So in like 1 year, I think that I had watched over 500 movies or something like that. That's how deep into escapism I was, because I didn't want to deal with the real world stuff. But when you get that so far in, and we also have, real world issues that are going on that are important not to ignore, I started to want to find a way um, to process what I needed to process through my escapism. So still have my love of watching movies and what the joy of movie watching brings to me, but still also be active and aware of the important issues that are going on in the world or even in my personal life. So I started to draw a comic that starred myself. And that comic was titled Cinephilia, and it's just me talking about movies and how much they mean to me, and also addressing how movies uh, exist within our real world and how they, you know, kind of shape the real world, and also how the real world kind of shapes movies. So like I did a comic on whitewashing because that was big at the time, and it's still happening, where we have all of these stories that are not all of these stories from various cultures that are not white, but when a movie gets made of them, um, Hollywood or other companies are really like the first thing they do is cast a white actor, or they try to tell it from a white perspective. So I did a comic about like the importance of like being true to culture and not whitewashing, and how Hollywood does this and that. And I also did was doing comics about movies that I love, like Night of the Living Dead. I did a whole comic about how important that movie was for black people, because it was like, the first time that we saw a black character like Ben in a lead role that was like the hero, but still at the end of the movie we get a tragic ending. So I'm like exploring movies through comics, um, but also having this kind of social commentary and awareness for, for myself and also for people reading.
And Cinephilia, it ends up getting picked up by Perception Studios to become a live streamed interactive movie talk show on Twitch. And you hosted it for 150 episodes. What was that experience like?
That was a lot of fun. So, Perception Studio was actually a studio that was started by some of my coworkers from Disney. Because
Oh,
when we unionized, we ended up going through all of this stuff, and Disney ended up letting all of us go. So we all had to find other work. So they started this company where they were doing live Dungeons and Dragons campaigns with puppets on Twitch. And so it became really popular. But they were looking to expand their Twitch streaming and incorporate other shows that weren't just that. So they approached me about like they already knew that I was into movies. They already knew that I like had all of these ideas and commentary on movies. So they approached me about turning the Cinephilia comic into a live show. And we would do it like once a week. Art Vega, who was my co-host on the show, he was one of the partners in Perception Studio. The two of us would just sit down once a week and live stream talking about movies. And it became like a big thing for us. It was like a weekly thing. I had to do so much research every week, and then we would sit down, and the audience, on Twitch is very interactive. So they would have their input, and the whole show became kind of like how the comic was about my perspective on cinema. The whole show became like how everyone has a perspective and everyone has a valid read of the things that they watch, and the audience is not always agreeing with me, and everybody has their own valid thing, and we could understand each other and know where each other are coming from. It was a lot of fun. We had a lot of episodes that were just about Marvel movies or like beloved movies like E.T. and stuff, and then we had to have episodes that were also about like harsh topics like art versus the artist. When you have a director who's not really a nice guy, but their movie is amazing, how do you reconcile that kind of thing? So it was a lot of really good discussions that was happening on Cinephilia, and I'm very proud of what we did for that show.
most definitely. And you've had some other comics, Anxious Acts. Can you talk a little bit about that and like what was the inspiration behind that? Because I see like, a lot of parallels between yourself.
Yep. So, like I was saying, like I wanted my comics to be more authentic and come from a queer and black perspective because I can speak to that naturally. And so I started to create, these are the projects that I'm working on currently. I started to create these characters that were kind of inspired by just myself and the things that I've been going through. So, like I was saying, I'm actually a socially anxious person. So I had this idea of creating this character who is so anxious about life. I mean, just about everything. He's got this like cool demeanor on the outside, but inside he's like worrying about everything. Like when you walk into a store, oh my God, I have to take my hands out of my pocket to make sure people don't think that I'm trying to steal something. That's something that Black people think, that Black people go through. We have a history of like these ideas that other people don't even realize are going on in our head. So I thought about like, what would this character be like if he was just so anxious that his anxiety actually created a monster that would just hover around him all the time and whisper things in his ear that are not helpful for him, and how would he overcome that? And so that's who Anxious Axe is. He's got this anxiety monster that's always hanging off of him and clawing off of him, and it's kind of a cross between like psychological horror because it's all kind of in his mind, but at the same time it's a kind of body horror because this monster is attaching itself to him. And it's something that I feel like it's written directly from my heart. And I do find that now writing this kind of stuff is very cathartic for me. Like I find that I can process things better and be able to speak about things and understand myself more. Like it's funny how I create a character and then the character will then start to tell me stuff about myself. So it's cool that way.
Yeah, that's really awesome. You have a new comic book project, Siren Point Oh. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So yeah, Siren O is another one of those new characters that I've been developing. So I during the pandemic, we're all wondering how we're going to make money. Everything was like all upsetting, and of course, a lot of people turned to OnlyFans, and I considered it. I mean, I've been able to get by on my charm in certain ways. So I thought maybe OnlyFans is something that I could be successful at. But then I started to weigh what that actually meant and how comfortable I would actually be doing that kind of work. So Siren O was created out of my idea of like um, being someone who I'm also a Leo, so I'm someone who kind of likes attention and likes to be in the center of attention, but at the same time, I'm anxious about it and I don't always like it and I don't like it in certain ways. And there's, you know, certain people who will, if you give them, an inch, they'll take the whole arm and it becomes too much attention. So this character is a siren. He's a modern day siren, like from Greek mythology, and we know that sirens have this ability to draw people in, um, and kind of like draw sailors in and kill them is basically what sirens did. And so this character is a siren who works as a sex worker, and so he gets all of this attention, and he can magically draw people in. But he also is someone who doesn't like the attention, and he finds being a siren being kind of um, like being put in a cage in a way, because he has like this certain role that he's supposed to traditionally fulfill, but he doesn't want to. So it's all about like my own thoughts um, about sexuality and sex work and what is appropriate for myself. Obviously, like sex work is work, and I'm very supportive of sex workers, and I wanted to make sure that the comic is also sex positive, but still dealing with like these issues of like what is sex positive to an individual because it's all on a personal basis. So that's yeah, that's what Cyrano is.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And one of the cool things you could do, you could read your comments early on your Patreon. What gave you like, the idea, like, deal with that platform?
Well, Patreon is what I ended up with instead of OnlyFans. Because I felt like, I'm definitely very comfortable with putting my work out there, putting my comics out there. We'll see if OnlyFans ever happens or not. Still considering it, but Patreon definitely has been helpful in helping me keep a schedule. As far as like making sure I have new work coming out because it's also like during the pandemic we all started kind of working from home and then we kind of got lazy and weren't doing a lot of things. So I think Patreon has been good with making sure that I'm constantly putting something out. Because in addition to these stories that I'm creating myself, I've also been working as an editor on other people's works. But I feel like I still need to be putting out my own works as well. So that's how Patreon's been great. So you can see all my stuff on Patreon.
That's awesome. You know, you mentioned the OnlyFans thing, and like, why haven't you put your comics though on OnlyFans? Because I feel like the platform's not just for, sex workers. Like I think like, there's a market for that as well. Like if I'm not completely wrong, like it seems like there's people who do a lot of other things on OnlyFans besides that.
You're 100% correct. Like there definitely are more than just the thirst stuff on OnlyFans. And I actually did consider putting my comics on there and still might, because obviously Cyrano, and some of the other characters that I've been creating lately are adult content.
Right.
Um, and I think that it probably will do well on OnlyFans. At the moment, the Patreon takes less money than OnlyFans would. That's the only reason that I haven't jumped to OnlyFans yet. But I have been considering like being on both at the same time. Like it
Right.
wouldn't hurt to do multiple things. It's just a matter of time consumption, making sure everything is updated on everything.
Most definitely. Uh, what's next for you in your career?
Well, I've been like I said, editing these other anthologies lately. I just wrapped up the third anthology, which was We Belong, which is an all queer Black um, science fiction anthology of various creators. Um, and now I'm currently editing a book for Rupert Kennard, who is like one of the legendary Black queer creators in comics. He really uh, shaped the scene early on with his work. And so I've been editing a historic collection of all of his cathartic comics. That's we're sending it off to the printer this week, so it'll be out soon. And after that, I kind of am looking forward to focusing on expanding these characters that I've been creating more. Because the editing and creating brain are kind of two different things, and it's hard to switch back and forth. So now that editorial work is kind of winding down for me, I'm really excited to jump into creating more with Anxious Acts and Cyrano. And I have another character I've just been creating called Benamun, who's like a half human, half rabbit god. Yeah, so these are characters that I'm really excited about working more with and establishing more of them and establishing more of my own current work that really focuses on the issues that I have to deal with, or the issues that queer and Black people are dealing with at the moment. So
What would be your advice to people who want to get into comic books?
number one advice is if you want to make comics, make sure you want to make them for love because you have this passion and your drive to make them and not for money because you do not make a whole lot of money making comics. But I think that they are an amazing art form, just like film. I mean, there are two different ways of storytelling, but they're both amazing. And I think that if you have the drive for it, um, just do it. Like also don't worry about your comics being perfect, especially when you're first starting out. Just start drawing and start writing and whatever happens happens. Perfection is something that we always strive for, but we don't ever reach really because you're always as an artist you're always trying to grow and change, and whatever you're doing next is better than the last thing you did. So I would say you could strive for perfection, but don't let perfection hinder you. Just start drawing, and even if it's not perfect, it's going to be amazing.
Definitely, that's great advice, William O. Tyler. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'd love to have you back. Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed being here.
Definitely, have a great one.
You too. Thanks.